I'd argue that older graphics cards still have a place in modern PC gaming, within reason of course. I'm not saying you can play Cyberpunk on a Voodoo 2, but the Polaris and Pascal-based GPUs of the mid-2010s can perform surprisingly well in even the latest demanding titles. While many of these graphics cards can be picked up for a song, the sticker shock often comes later on, in the form of a significantly higher energy bill. Let's see if there's anything that can be done about that. Many people write off older CPUs and GPUs because of the high power consumption of these older parts, and I can't deny it. While the GTX 1080 Ti might be a better option for 1440p gaming than an RTX 4060 in some titles, it uses more than twice the power, and it's not even a major outlier. If your electricity costs are low enough, you could maybe justify paying the higher running costs, especially if you already own a capable older card and are saving hundreds by not upgrading. On the other hand, if you were considering picking up a cheap GPU from a few years ago, its low upfront cost may be deceptive, and over time, you could find yourself spending more than you would have on a new card. To make these older GPUs a little more attractive, the best solution is to find ways of trimming the fat, making them leaner and more efficient without sacrificing so much performance that they lose their appeal. I mean, of course, undervolting. In demanding situations like gaming, a GPU needs a constant high flow of power. Higher voltages mean that it can run at higher frequencies for longer. However, higher voltages also result in more heat, higher power consumption, and shorter lifespans. Undervolting is the practice of reducing the voltage. Done properly, the goal is to strike the best balance of performance and power consumption. Sometimes this can be incredibly effective. Several generations of AMD GPUs, notably the GCN5 Vega series, are known for being overvolted from the factory, meaning there's a high chance that even a poorly binned GPU can have its power consumption reduced with little or no consequences. The best Vega GPUs can see both a drop in power consumption and an increase in clock speeds, as I saw in my Vega 56 review last year. But that's not going to be the focus today. Instead, I'm taking 4 previous gen graphics cards and seeing how far I can drop their power consumption without hurting FPS. My chosen tool for this task is MSI Afterburner. This cross-platform GPU tuning utility is the industry standard for YouTubers, because as well as tuning, it also lets us benchmark. There are plenty of other options for tuning GPU voltages. For example, AMD owners can undervolt with the Radeon utility software, but the end result is effectively the same. To see how effective my undervolting is, I'm running MSI's Combustor burn-in test, while monitoring power consumption and clock speeds using Afterburner. I'm not running full benchmark sets in a traditional sense, but I'll be using The Last of Us and Cyberpunk 2077 as examples of some of the more power-hungry games available. Hardware-wise, I'm testing these graphics cards using the MPG PC with a Ryzen 5 5600X and 32GB of DDR4 3600, all powered by an EVGA 700W GD power supply. That's the name of the PSU, by the way. I'm not pissed off with it. I've already scratched the surface of undervolting the RX 580 in my review of the card the other week. In fact, it's the reason I'm making this video. As a GCN4 Polaris card, it's a good bet that most of those currently in circulation have been used for crypto mining, and many crypto miners will have run them at reduced voltages and clock speeds to maximize efficiency. This is because, like Vega, a gaming spec Polaris GPU uses a lot more power than it really needs to. Straight out of the gate with no adjustments, my 580 clocks in at 1360 MHz with a voltage of about 1150 mV and roughly 130 watts of power consumption. Turning up the power limit to its maximum of 50%, in this case, does nothing. The GPU isn't inclined to increase clock speeds above 1360 MHz, and so the power graph doesn't change at all. Dropping the power limit to below 0 would reduce power consumption, but in the process, it would also drop the clock speed, and that's not the goal here. Undervolting is done not by using the voltage slider, but the curve editor tool. As I want to hit the maximum clock speed at a lower voltage, I drag the points down by approximately 50 mV. You can see the power graph has now dropped to 115 watts, a pretty decent 11% drop in consumption, and the clock speed remains unaffected. Dropping the voltage even further has exactly the same effect, more power saved for no loss in performance. At negative 100 millivolts, the GPU is pulling roughly 105 watts. At minus 130, it's scraping beneath the 100 watt barrier, and at minus 150, it's around 96 watts. The returns from undervolting are diminishing at this point, which is just as well. As we'll see in the gaming tests, undervolting doesn't always work as well in practice. While The Last of Us could actually stomach the full 150 millivolt drop, Cyberpunk could not. It crashed only 30 seconds into the test. With an extra 30 millivolts, however, the game seemed stable and completed my test run from V's apartment to the city centre. The stock settings run peaked at about 140 watts of consumption at this on-ramp over the river, whereas the undervolted run only hit 115 watts at the same point. The difference in performance? Indistinguishable. The undervolted run came in 0.2 FPS higher on average, with identical 1% lows and less than 1 FPS lower 0.1%. The story isn't all that different in The Last of Us. Once more at stock settings, the RX 580 pulls 130 watts at this moment where Joel is approaching a fallen tree. With the voltage dropped by 120 millivolts, the same moment peaks at 105 watts. And once more, the frame rates are close to identical. Stock and undervolted average scores are exactly the same, with the latter winning on 1% and losing on 0.1%, both by less than half a frame per second. For a few minutes of playing with sliders then, the RX 580 has saved between 22 and 25 watts of power, with zero loss in performance. For context, the 6GB GTX 1060, the 580's competitor at the time of its launch, managed to peak at 104 watts in Cyberpunk while scoring 10% lower on average. The GTX 1650 GDDR5 version managed 67 watts, but also performed even worse. The RX 5500 XT, which ostensibly replaced the 580, peaked at 97 watts in the same test, and this is the only one of these cards which actually outperformed the RX 580. The GTX 1080 Ti is the poster child for older hardware that can still game. 8 of the 13 modern titles I tested can run at 1440p high settings at 60 FPS or better, but in some games it can use up to 250 watts of power in the process. Unlike AMD, Nvidia aren't known for overvolting from the factory. In fact, typically a Geforce card of this generation will convert every last erg you give it into higher clock speeds, so dropping power while maintaining performance doesn't appear to be on the cards. This time then, testing was more about mitigating loss than avoiding it. The official turbo frequency of my 1080 Ti is 1671 MHz, but at stock settings the GPU automatically boosts itself well in excess of 1800 MHz. This frequency is far from stable due to the chaotically oscillating power draw. Increasing the power limit in Afterburner means for a far more stable frequency, almost locked at 1911 MHz. But the power draw is now up from a maximum of 260 watts to around the 300 watt mark. To get the 1080 under control, I decided to stabilise it at its 250 watt rated TDP. For this, I targeted the regular boost frequency achieved by the card at stock settings, around the 1860 to 1880 MHz range, with the voltage as low as I could get it without crashing. I found that crashes started to occur around 900 millivolts, so I settled on 950, which is about 100 millivolts below stock. This managed to maintain a steady frequency while holding power consumption to just over 250 watts. So, the card was now behaving, sure, but it didn't really achieve the goal of the video, that is, to drop power consumption while retaining performance. As that didn't seem possible, I chose a more realistic target. The 1080 Ti's boost speed, as defined by the spec sheet, is, again, a mere 1671 MHz, or 200 MHz lower than I'd been testing at. After some testing, I found the sweet spot was 825 mV at 1680 MHz, which saw power consumption drop below 200 watts, a roughly 12% drop in clocks for a 20% drop in power consumption. This time, Cyberpunk experienced a substantial drop in performance from the reduced voltages, as you'd expect, in its unrestrained form, reaching up to 1936 MHz and 239 watts while driving over the bridge. The card delivered 57 FPS on average. Dropping the voltage by 100 mV and clocks to 1898 reduced the peak power draw by about 20% to 192 watts and dropped average FPS by 3.4 frames, about a 6% loss. The lowest power setup took that consumption down to just 146 watts, only a few watts above a stock RX 580. The average FPS fell to 49.3, about 14% down from the max power setup and 8% down from the middle option. For power savings of 40 and 20% respectively, those aren't bad numbers. Once more, The Last of Us asks for a little less power than Cyberpunk. With nothing but the power limit increase, the 1080 Ti peaks at about 210 watts. The first clock speed and voltage drop takes that down to 173 watts, reducing the frame rate by just 2.4 FPS, or 3.5% if you prefer. The second drop takes the power draw to a max of 135 watts, 36% lower than maximum, while reducing FPS by almost 14%. Compared to the 950 mV test, FPS is down by 8% and power consumption by 22%. Since the introduction of RTX, Nvidia's been very interested in promoting their unique selling points, hardware-accelerated ray tracing and DLSS in particular, but these days the RTX 2060 is really more attractive as a fairly cheap, fairly powerful, upper entry-level to lower mid-range card. The 2060 is already a pretty efficient card, but it is 5 years and 2.5 generations old at this point, so it could always stand to be even more efficient. With absolutely no tweaking at all, my particular Gigabyte model boosts to 1860 MHz before settling down into the low 1800s. With a stock voltage of around 1 volt, this means the power graph peaks at just over 170 watts. Considering that the spec sheet gives a boost clock of 1755 and the TDP is 160 watts, this is fairly conservative coming from the GTX 1080 Ti, so I felt there was plenty of room for improvement. Dropping to 900 mV yielded some excellent results while still allowing for a clock speed of almost 1900 MHz, but this didn't translate well in game. Pushing to 925 and dropping the clock to 1875 made sure both games were stable, and the synthetic test saw a drop of about 20 watts to just under 150. In Cyberpunk, this was about as successful as you could ask for. At stock settings, the card starts at close to 1900 MHz, but drops throughout the course of the test, while the power draw across the bridge tops out at 170 watts. Undervolted, with the clock speed locked to 1975 MHz, frame rates are basically unaffected. Averages drop by a single frame, 1% and 0.1% gain a frame. Power consumption, however, reduced by more than you might have thought, only going as high as 136 watts. That's about a 34 watt saving for essentially no change in performance. The Last of Us once more shows itself to be a little less thirsty than Cyberpunk, with the default setting only consuming a max of 148 watts, even though clocks actually exceed 1900 MHz at the start of the test and remain higher than in Cyberpunk. Undervolting brings that consumption down to just 118 watts. And what does that mean for performance? Well, nothing really. Once again, averages remain basically the same, in fact, closer than Cyberpunk. 1s and 0.1s are reduced, but the former by less than a frame and the latter by less than 2. Only 30 watts saved this time, but again, it's free. Finally, as I record this, the Radeon RX 6700 has yet to be replaced in AMD's lineup, but it is running on previous gen architecture. RDNA 3 is reputedly far more efficient than its predecessor, but previous generation Radeons have proven to be extremely flexible in how far they can go when placed on an electricity diet, so it's worth seeing just what an RDNA 2 card can do when undervolted. At default settings, the 6700 consumes a little under 160 watts, with clock speeds shifting around in the low to mid 2400 MHz range. Turning the power limit up by the maximum of 15% stabilises the clock speed somewhat at over 2500 MHz, but sends the power graph way up to 180 watts. Dropping voltage allows me to keep the 2500 plus clocks while dropping power consumption. At minus 50 mV it drops into the 160s, and at minus 100 it drops below 160 watts. At minus 150 it consumes even less, right up to the point that it crashes, but that wouldn't be relevant anyway. Once I started game testing, the 6700 would prove unstable even at minus 100 mV. I compromised at minus 75, and although I don't have synthetic results, it seems fair to estimate consumption at somewhere in the low 150s. Cyberpunk's default run showed how little the synthetic test resembles actual gaming anyway. The clock speed climbed way up into the 2500s, and while it did fluctuate dramatically throughout the run, its highest clocks were ever so slightly higher than the undervolted run. Power consumption peaked at 157 watts. Undervolting, even by only 75 mV, tames the 6700 somewhat, dropping power to 130 watts. Performance, again, is close enough to be called essentially the same, or at least close enough that you need to be benchmarking to tell the difference. And I'm not going to ramble through it again. The Last of Us is a tiny bit less demanding on power than Cyberpunk, but draws level when undervolted, and again, performance is essentially unaffected. What do these power savings mean in reality? Well, according to a calculator I found online, in the UK the 22 to 26 watt reduction from undervolting the RX 580 means for a saving of between 13.2 and 15.6 pence per week, assuming about 20 hours of use per week. That's up to £7.49 per year saved. Even the biggest reduction, by turning the hard-drinking 1080 Ti into a more socially acceptable lush, would save a maximum of £29.02 per year. Not an offensively small saving, but one that could also be achieved by simply gaming for one less hour per week. And that's without sacrificing any of your precious frames either. Does that mean you shouldn't bother undervolting? Well, I'm not your dad. I'm not going to yell at you for not thinking about the electricity bill, or leaving lights on when you leave a room, or touching the thermostat. Maybe the financial incentive to undervolt isn't strong enough for you. There are, however, plenty of good reasons for undervolting that I haven't really touched upon. Lower temperatures and longer lifespans, both of which can be incredibly relevant factors when extending the useful life of your PC components. And of course, I'm not oblivious to the rest of the world. The scalper pandemic is mostly over in the UK and US, but I know some places can't get hold of the latest generation GPUs, and street prices are a long way above the MSRP. Hopefully, if you're struggling to deal with the increased cost of living in an ever more greedy world, undervolting can make living with older PC hardware just a little easier to deal with. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.